The idea that journalist equals criminal was seeded in 2016, the words of 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa calling out the Duterte years in the Philippines. The journalist's exclusive interview with France 24. You'll hear excerpts from it. The founder of the news website Rappler talking about how social media, and in particular Facebook, have distorted democracy in our country these past 6 years. Now, with the term-limited outgoing president throwing in the towel on his initial plan to run as vice president, could populist Rodrigo Duterte keep power vicariously through his daughter, Sara Duterte Carpio? For now, she's not running for president. She's instead running for re-election as her dad's successor as mayor of Davao. Is Duterte really retiring from politics? And what will politics look like after Duterte's brutal war on drugs? With candidates that include boxing legend Manny Pacquiao, what kind of leader do Filipinos want to take them out of the COVID pandemic? What kind of democracy do they want? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the shadow of Rodrigo Duterte as we enter campaign season in the Philippines. Joining us from Manila, Richard Hedarian, Associate Professor of Politics at Polytechnic University of the Philippines, author of Rise of Duterte, a Populist Revolt Against Elite Democracy. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
From Quezon City, not too far from Manila, in fact, neighboring Manila, Sol Iglesias, Assistant Professor at the Political Science Department at the University of the Philippines. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Always a pleasure to welcome back David Cameron, Adjunct Professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are you, David?
Fine, thanks.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The first ever Filipina to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and she pulled no punches in that interview. Maria Ressa, who spoke to France 24's Nadia Masi.
You know, I think about it like termites eating wood. The wood looks really strong, but then when you step on it, it cracks and breaks and you can fall. The Dutertes have maintained power in Davao City since 1988, and they've used a legal loophole to keep the Philippines guessing after filing certificates of candidacy. It ended last Friday, but now because of a legal loophole they've used in the past, and he used in 2016, which is substitution, we're going to have to wait till November 15th to figure out who the final candidates are for president and vice president. I think the problem is this is going to be the battle for facts, our elections. And American social media platforms, these American companies, are going to play a crucial role if they don't put guardrails on the algorithmic spread of lies. That's first. And then the second thing is, will our institutions recover? Right? Within about 6 months of the first year, you could see them caving in from within. And these cases that I've faced and Rappler has faced, in a normal time, 5 years ago, they wouldn't have flourished in court. So now we fight them in court. And I'd certainly hope that there's a rejuvenation of the institutions.
Well, you're alluding there to what's been happening at Facebook in the last few weeks, particularly in the United States. There, of course, we've had that whistleblower accusing the company of effectively putting profit over the need to curb misinformation. Is that what you see happening as well in the Philippines?
It's what's happening everywhere around the world. Look, we blew the whistle on this, not to use Francis Haugen's word, but we in 2016, we demanded an end to impunity of President Duterte and his brutal drug war and Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. And we continue to demand that because there hasn't been effective change for the better in both of these strong men and the organizations that they run. I think that the problem we have here is that social media, Facebook, which is the world's largest distributor of news, is governed by algorithms that actually, and this research has shown, that spreads lies laced with anger and hate faster and further than facts. So this is where the news are. So our news is being distributed on a platform that is biased against facts, and it is biased against journalists. If you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without trust in the room, nothing is possible. A shared reality. And this leads to perhaps why a peace prize, right? Because any facts are the beginning of any kind of human endeavor. If we don't restore that, trying to deal with existential problems like the coronavirus or climate change or the battle for truth is going to be impossible to do. We need to put the guardrails around the technology.
Richard Adarian, before we delve into Philippines politics, your reaction to what we just heard and couching it as a battle for facts, and you heard there that what you heard there from Maria Ressa was basically saying it's not just the Philippines, it's around the world, that nations, to in effect, give up some of their sovereignty when they use social media?
Well, in many ways, we may have entered what they call the post-facts or post-truth era. And I think this has been a challenge all across the world. The other challenge, of course, is also the coterminous rise of authoritarian populists all around the world. But you see, populism has different manifestations, and we have varieties of populism. And the impact that authoritarian populists have is also differential across different continents and contexts. I think in places like Europe, for instance, and the United States, indeed, there is a problem with authoritarian populism, but at least you have a semblance of institutionalized checks and balances. There are certain guardrails that put some limit on the ability of authoritarian populists to really push the country and the democracy of the country over the cliff. The problem is that you don't have those kinds of guardrails.
Is it a chicken and egg question? Are these populists, as you say, with authoritarians possible without social media?
Well, I think to reduce this to just one factor is something that academics and social scientists are not very much comfortable with. So I honestly do not fall for this kind of monocausal explanations. In fact, in my book, The Rise of Duterte, I try to look at convergence of many factors that contributed to the rise of populism. But of course, when you have the disinformation networks proliferating on these algorithmically facilitated kind of patterns on social media, you are also making it very difficult for journalists, for Democrats and activists to make the case for democracy. And therefore, you're actually reinforcing the power and the appeal of authoritarian populists who are much more concerned with performative governance, who are much more concerned with impression management, macho posturing, and intimidation of their critics than really fighting for the basic needs of their people. And we see over the past year, one of the biggest failures in terms of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and also the ensuing economic crisis, it mostly happens in populist countries. Populists, including President Duterte, have been huge failures in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And that, again, goes back to the problem. If you have information ecosystems that reinforce lies and networks of disinformation, it becomes very hard to have not only proper journalistic discussion, but proper evidence-based public policy discussion. So now we're seeing also existential threats to a lot of democracies, not only in terms of rule of law, but also in terms of policy effectiveness.
Policy effectiveness. Sol Iglesias, listening to Richard there, it sounds like you could replace the word the Philippines with, say, Brazil, where they're also having an election next year. Let me ask you, though, what are your thoughts when you heard the words there of Maria Ressa?
Yes, well, first of all, it's a huge honor for the Nobel Peace Prize to be awarded to a Filipino, especially for Maria Ressa's work as a journalist and as a defender of press freedom, shining a light on the violent and authoritarian regime of President Rodrigo Duterte. But press freedom and more broadly democracy in the Philippines remain under attack. The Philippines is the 7th most dangerous place for journalists to practice their profession. Ressa's own news site, Rappler, had its license suspended, and she faces legal action for various reasons, likely motivated by her scrutiny of Duterte. You know, she mentioned termites eating wood. Under Marcos, we had referred to the courageous Philippine press corps as the mosquito press. This was during the Marcos dictatorship from 1972 to 1986. They were small, they were treated like pests, but they were determined to keep our leaders accountable, as Ressa said.
Yeah, you say they were determined like that, and you refer to the fact that there are these court cases coming up, or these convictions. In fact, even they're being appealed by Maria Ressa. Interesting to note, the president's spokesperson was asked to react to Ressa's win as Nobel Peace Laureate. Let's listen.
Well, it's a victory for a Filipina and we're very happy for that kasi wala naman pong utak talangka dito sa Malacanang. But of course, it is true that there are individuals who feel that Maria Ressa still has to clear her name before our courts, as in fact, she's a convicted felon for libel, cyber libel in the Philippines, and she faces other cases in the Philippines. Now, that's for the courts to decide.
All right, so Maria Ressa congratulated as a convicted felon there by the president's spokesperson. And in her interview earlier with Nadia Masi, Ressa was asked about whether this is a kind of shield, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. She's got experience because, after all, she donned the cover of Time magazine in 2018 as their Person of the Year.
This is my 35th year as a journalist, and in less than 2 years, the Philippine government filed 10 arrest warrants against me. I've never lived through anything like that. Look, in 2018, when Time magazine named me as gave one of the covers for the Person of the Year, it hit me in the gut because, like the Nobel, I didn't know it was going to happen. And when it happened, I thought this is going to get worse. And in the end, it wound up putting a shield around me and around Rappler. This spotlight that the Nobel Committee gave to us in the Philippines gave a boost of adrenaline, not just to me, to Rappler, but to all journalists here, especially as we prepare for crucial presidential elections that are going to be happening in May. But here's the rub. The last time a journalist received this prestigious award was in the 1930s, and that journalist languished in a Nazi concentration camp and died of complications from torture in that, right? So this is what I was telling our team during our meeting afterwards. It's, that yes, this is a time of celebration in the sense that things could get better, but we always, as we have been for the last 5 years, must be prepared that things could get worse, and we must keep doing our jobs.
So Sol Iglesias, the future is unwritten, you agree?
Well, yes. One thing you need to understand about Philippine democratic institutions they are a response to the dictatorship of President Ferdinand Marcos that I mentioned earlier. He had declared martial law in 1972 and ruled autocratically until his ouster by popular revolt in 1986. Since then, the Constitution limits each president to one single term, a 6-year term. However, now in his final year, President Duterte's lame duck status is kicking in, and erstwhile allies are now figuring out their next move. But he's still fighting tooth and nail, announcing at one point that he would run for vice president. Now, this would test constitutional limits. For now, the name of the game seems to be whether or not a Duterte proxy will take his place in the presidential palace in Malacanang, or a powerful ally, no less than the former Senator Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the dictator's son. But more importantly, there's a lot of uncertainty now that the International Criminal Court has been empowered to investigate President Duterte for crimes against humanity, for instigating a so-called war on drugs that has resulted in as many as 30,000 deaths in the past 5 years. The ICC investigation also covers the time he was mayor of Davao City, where he gained notoriety for his link to the Davao City Death Squad. Now, I've studied this violence, and it really was the blueprint for the violence that the Philippines is experiencing now under Duterte's presidency.
David Camru, it was his promise when he ran for office back in 2016, Rodrigo Duterte, because a lot of Filipinos fed up with crime, and he said, "I'm going to deal with it." And of course, there were those extrajudicial killings that you just heard Sol mention.
The tragedy is that he's still as popular today with 75% approval ratings, according to the social weather stations, which is a fairly reliable opinion poll in the Philippines. 75% at the beginning of his term, 75% approval at the end of his term. Yes, there is approval for the war against drugs. Why? Because the Philippines does have a serious problem with methamphetamines. But even if, 30,000 people, up to 30,000, as Sol has mentioned, have been killed, and no serious drug dealer has been arrested, or drug manufacturer, because methamphetamines has been arrested, or drug cartels really broken up. And somehow there's a kind of there seems to be an action that something is happening. You need to understand that there is no trust in the legal system. The prisons are overcrowded, 3 to 6 times the number they should have. People are arrested. They don't actually get to be tried, so there's no trust in the legal system. So what's left for the people? There's this belief in that vigilante violence may be the solution. The police themselves admit to up to about 6,000 killings, extrajudicial killings, whereas the amnesty figures and those of Human Rights Watch.
This sort of libertarian view that the state isn't doing it, so we have to take the law into our own hands. Again, I want to bring it back to what Maria Ressa said at the outset about how this kind of works well with the Facebook kind of generation that...
It works well, and it also works with the colonial heritage is that the Americans created a representative electoral system. It wasn't by universal suffrage, but there was a weak state. And they created a system which really functions on patronage, so that local politicians are patrons. It's expensive to be elected, so you have to do things and you distribute. So there's this kind of belief that the strong man, as Richard Hedron indicated, the strong man can solve these problems, which the state has been unable to solve.
Which the state has been unable to solve. When we come back in the France 24 debate, we're going to hear more from our interview with Maria Ressa and also look ahead to those elections next year. Stay with us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the Philippines as it enters election mode now, and where one of the most prominent critics of the outgoing president has just received the Nobel Peace Prize. Maria Ressa, the journalist we're talking about it with from Manila, Richard Hadarian, associate professor of politics at Polytechnic University of the Philippines, author of Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy. From neighboring Quezon City, Sol Iglesias, assistant professor of political science at the Political Science Department at the University of the Philippines, and David Camru, adjunct professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Maria Ressa becoming only the 18th woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And she told France 24's Nadia Massi earlier how in 2021, women still face an uphill struggle.
I think it's, the feminist movement has taken many steps forward, but again, technology has pushed it further back again. It's almost like by empowering the rise of these types of leaders like Duterte, like Trump, like Bolsonaro, you have this sexist, macho, and misogynist types that force us, that give permission to others in society to behave, to become their worst selves. And inevitably, when we look at the data that we have in the Philippines, women journalists are attacked at least 10 times more than men. So you absorb that, right? In terms of the Nobel, I think it's hard. You can't put a quota. I mean, it's almost like I'm a minority in the United States. When I was in school, if you come in under a minority program, do I really deserve it? Or did I get it because I was a minority? And it's a question you would ask, right? So I think we need to move collectively. And in 1995 at the Beijing Women's Conference, there were a set of principles that were laid out that the world was going to try to work towards. It was a time of great optimism. We've moved some, but there's so much still left to do. And I think that first, let's put the guardrails on tech so that women can reclaim the space. So many women journalists have opted out. Other women politicians have opted out. Let's bring them back, and then we move the cultures forward.
It's interesting, Sol Iglesias, because we have a presidential election coming up here in France next year, and there is a candidate from the far right, for instance, making a lot of political hay out of being politically incorrect. When you listen there to Maria Ressa, do you feel as though for women's rights in the Philippines, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, or, as she says, it's anyone's guess as to which way it's going?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, if we look at President Duterte himself, this is a man who, in his 2016 campaign, was basically caught on video making a rape joke. And later on, as president, when speaking about communist insurgents, female communist insurgents, he said, just shoot them in their private parts. So, it's kind of difficult to imagine how much lower it can get from here. And I would also like to point out that in addition to Maria Ressa, the president has also targeted other women who have tried to act as countervailing forces against the authoritarian bent of his regime and fight for democracy. For example, another critic, Senator Leila de Lima, has languished in detention for about 5 years. She was chair of the Commission on Human Rights, and she had investigated the Davao City death squad and President Duterte when he was still mayor. Then, as senator in 2016 and 2017, she started a Senate inquiry on the war on drugs, which started to produce quite damning, potentially damning evidence against President Duterte. And she was then accused of drug-related crimes and has been in detention since then.
And would you say that being a woman for her is an aggravating circumstance, that the sentence has been harsh in part because she is a woman?
Well, I think the pattern at the very least has been clear. There was also the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Maria Sereno, whom, the president had spoken quite hostilely against her when she also tried to stand up to him because she alleged and accused him of trying to curtail the independence of the judiciary. And, it's quite likely that her removal from her position as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was engineered from the presidential palace, Malacanang. So the pattern of these women standing up to him and then being cut down is quite clear.
All right, let's get to that race that's starting to heat up. We saw candidates submit their forms this week, and polls had consistently shown, remember, presidents in the Philippines are term limited, 1 6-year term, that Rodrigo Duterte's intention to run, even as vice president, was perceived as contrary to the spirit of the Constitution. Last week, the 76-year-old acknowledged as much.
In obedience to the will of the people who, after all, placed me in the presidency many years ago, I now say sa mga kababayan ko, sundin ko ang gusto ninyo. And today, I announce my retirement from politics. Salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Richard Adarian, are you a betting man? Was that really his retirement from politics?
Well, I think 6 years ago we heard almost exactly 6 years ago we heard him not running for the presidency and going to the sunset of his years. So it's actually, you better bet on this guy not saying the truth, right? Or, I mean, as far as Duterte is concerned, he's a consummate Machiavellian. He's going to always try to assess the balance of forces on the ground, and sometimes at the 11th hour or past it, he's going to make a decision to protect his interests. I mean, after all, President Duterte has clear motivations to stay in power in one way or another, right? The International Criminal Court has opened investigation into his war on drugs. The Philippines is a very hostile country, perhaps the second most hostile after South Korea to ex-presidents. All three previous presidents faced one form of political persecution, if not actual prosecution or the other. Duterte is looking at that, and it's not looking very good for him. So he has all the motivations to stay. There are also concerns about the independence of the Philippines Commission on Elections, on the integrity of the election process, among other things. But the reality is that I would argue that the tide is shifting against him. I mean, the reality is that presidential elections in the Philippines tend to be an anti-incumbent. And yes, Duterte may be popular, but let's not forget, these surveys are conducted in a climate of fear. These surveys are not conducted in my neighborhoods or upper middle class or rich Filipino neighborhoods. They're conducted in neighborhoods that tend to be also host to extrajudicial killings, to many people who are dependent on government assistance amid the pandemic. So yes, he is popular, but I take some of these numbers with a grain of salt. But even if you take those numbers, he had a 21-point decline since last year, November, right? So the trajectory is not very good for him. More than 50% of people from his home island of Mindanao said, please don't run for vice president. 60% in the Philippines said the same thing. His numbers in the latest surveys, he's now a distant second for the vice presidency, 11 points behind the Senate president. His daughter saw an 8-point decline and now statistically tied with Marcos and the charismatic mayor of Manila, not to mention Manny Pacquiao not far away. So I think the tide is shifting against Duterte, and he recognizes that they may pull off a substitution move next month. Actually, if you look at the rules, it's much more flexible. It also depends how the COMELEC will determine it. In fact, there used to be a rule that until the midday of elections, you can replace another candidate if you have the same family name. So we cannot say even by November what will be his move. But the reality is that on the ground, things are shifting against him. And it's in fact Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos, who's trying to consolidate the vote on the right. So the other candidates are trying to occupy the center. In the case of Leni Robredo, the vice president, she is positioning herself as the true opposition. This is an extremely fluid situation and can cut both ways. And as far as Duterte is concerned, perhaps his best bet is to have the Marcoses win in the upcoming election. So maybe we got the Duterte and complained a lot, but over the horizon, another Marcos could win. But at the same time, the centrist candidates and opposition have a lot to work with. Strings of corruption scandals have hit the government. The Philippines has had one of the deepest economic recessions on earth. It has had one of the highest infection rates for COVID-19 in the region. So as far as material is concerned, the opposition and centrist candidates can really work on that. But the question is, can they unify? One thing that is troubling me is this infighting among supposedly opposition candidates. Leni Robredo camp versus Manila Mayor Isko Moreno camp. This is not looking good. So I think if the opposition and centrist candidate continue their infighting, they're going to give this on a silver platter to the scion of the former dictator, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr.
All right, so let's go over this, David Cameron, because there's plenty of candidates. You just heard there, Richard mention the popular mayor of Manila, Isko Moreno, former actor, the current vice president, Leni Robredo. Those are the two moderates. But you also have, the son of, I've got gray hair, so I remember Ferdinand Marcos. Are Filipinos really ready to elect his son? I mean, this was a brutal dictatorship.
I think there's something the viewers need to understand is the electoral system. It's a one-round presidential election. So it's sufficient to get the largest number of votes. So Duterte, even though he was well elected, only received, I think it's about 43% of the votes. One of the more respected presidents, Ferdinand Ramos, I think was elected with about a quarter of the votes. So this one-round system, which is really quite damaging, means that you can have an opposition.
It's first past the post.
It's first past the post. And so if the opposition is divided, then it's quite feasible that Bongbong Marcos's son, could be elected president. And the other feature of the system is...
So it doesn't mean that half of Filipinos want to vote for a far-right candidate.
No, but, if there was a system I don't know why this system has been maintained, as in France or in Indonesia with a second round, with the candidates who get the second most votes, then that would encourage coalition building and you would have a candidate with a clear mandate elected. The other unique feature of the Filipino system is that the vice president is elected separately. So although each candidate has a ticket, he has his vice presidential candidate, the vice president is elected separately. So for the moment, the vice president, Leni Robredo, who's just declared that she's a candidate for the presidency, is that leader of the opposition.
Wait a minute, does that matter? Because isn't a vice president's role to cut ribbons at ceremonies?
Well, not necessarily, because in Philippine history, if the vice president is from the same political family, he or she is given political responsibilities within the cabinet. But Leni Robredo cannot even attend cabinet meetings of the government. So she is the leader of the opposition. She's got some degree of popularity because of the way she's dealt with the COVID crisis by getting voluntary donations. But the system, there wasn't a movement to try and have one opposition candidate. But what we have now, if we look at the candidates who are declared, amongst them, we have a kind of a casting, what in the Philippines we call a teleserie. It's like you've got the two...
Like soap opera, telenovelas.
Yeah. You've got, the two rags to riches stories, Manny Pacquiao, the boxer.
Manny Pacquiao, the world champion boxer.
That's right. Escano Moreno, who started life getting rubbish from the pile of rubbish near Manila, rags to riches story. You've got the widow in Leni Robredo. You've got the villain in Marcos. Elections are based on personality. It's not based on the particular programs, except in the vaguest possible terms that are expressed. And the kind of disinformation that Maria Ressa spoke about is aggravating this personalization of politics. And this lack of policy debate and personality politics, especially people who are ex-movie stars or sportsmen or that kind of thing.
So, Sol Iglesias, do you share Richard Adarian's concern that centrist candidates will not coalesce?
Well, yes. I don't think there's any realistic expectation that the opposition, or let's just call them the anti-Duterte or non-Duterte camps, are going to coalesce around one unity candidate. But I would like to make an additional comment there about Ferdinand Marcos Jr. or Bongbong Marcos. He has actually quite clearly come out to say that he would continue President Duterte's war on drugs with some differences. But the key difference that he did not mention is whether or not he would repudiate the violence. And there are no signs that he would probably continue a violent path. He has also said that he would shield President Duterte from the investigation of the ICC.
And what is it? Is it because there's so many Filipinos who are young? I mean, it's a young population. People don't remember the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, his father?
Well, I think we need to complicate the picture a little bit there about Duterte's popularity and all of that. Because there was a very strong youth component to the first major protests that occurred at the start of Duterte's presidency around September 2016. These were protests at the burial of former President Marcos in the Libingan ng mga Bayani, or the Hero Cemetery. So this was a huge controversy, and the youth came out for that, and they had these very trendy sort of emoji-laden, slang-laden protest placards and that sort of thing. So it also depends on which sectors of the youth we're talking about. But many of them are politically aware. They are aware of what had happened during the Marcos dictatorship. The main problem, perhaps, is that the education system may not necessarily reflect a very deep understanding of the history of our democracy and the history of those times. So yes, I think that there's still a lot of uncertainty. A lot can happen between now and May. And I wouldn't count the youth out in terms of trying to, constitute an opposition bloc against either the possibility of Bongbong Marcos becoming president or a Duterte proxy.
Richard Adarian, one final question for you. When you heard there a moment ago David Camru talk about Philippine elections as a popularity contest, does that mean in And on this set, last week, we were discussing the outrage over Facebook and its algorithm. But is it going to be yet another Facebook election?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me just respond as a millennial myself. If you look at the actually exit polls back in 2016, Bongbong Marcos, a lot of vote he was getting was from authoritarian nostalgia, not from ignorance of the youth. People in their 40s and 50s having some weird nostalgia for the Marcos era as a supposed golden age. And in fact, some of the toughest, proponents of a return to kind of a Marcos rule are people who are in their 40s, 50s, or even older, right? So this is the problem we have. It's nostalgia, which is a very powerful force. And as far as personality politics or social media is concerned, I mean, I think this is common all across the world. It's not like in the Philippines only. I mean, just look at the Americans, for heaven's sake, in the case of Trump, right? Zero background in politics, became their president, right? So I think we have to put things into context. In fairness, one thing you can say about Duterte, you may 100% disagree with him, but he made the previous elections not only about personalities, but policy, the war on drugs, right? And I think in these elections, there are going to be some big policies that are going to be discussed. One of them is China and the South China Sea disputes. So Bongbong Marcos or Sara Duterte, whoever is going to run for the administration and the right, they may make actually, ironically, more China-friendly comments, and they may go towards a more China-friendly foreign policy like Duterte himself. So the centrist and opposition candidates are going to go after him. Manny Pacquiao, in fact, he declared his essential opposition to Duterte by first questioning Duterte's toughness in dealing with China. So it's very interesting to see how policy issues, foreign policy issues, could actually be a big issue. And lastly, on the issue of social media, well, I mean, I am very active on social media with hundreds of thousands of followers. So I try to actually see what's happening on the ground as far as social media is concerned. No, this will be a war on all fronts. Not only social media, we're talking about TikTok now, which is going to be a big force in this upcoming elections, especially because it appeals to Generation Z, even the younger first-time voters. Still, ground war, networks on the ground is going to be very important. Air war, mainstream media advertisement is going to be important. So I think reducing this to just social media misses the point. Everyone has their own social media troll farm or army right now. So I think the field is equalizing there, but the fight goes to narratives, to endurance, to consistency of communications and messaging, to ground war, networks on the ground with local government units, and your ability to raise funds so that you're seen on TV advertisement. Television still matters in the Philippines. Latest data by Pulse Asia, among others, show that still the majority of Filipinos are getting their political news from television, and then comes radio, social media, and others. So this is a multi-layered, multifarious contest. It's circus-like, it can be chaotic, but the fate of the Philippines' besieged democracy is definitely hanging in the balance, not to mention the Philippines' relationship with U.S. and China.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, as we head towards that election next spring. I want to thank you, Richard Adarin, for joining us from Manila. Saul Iglesias in neighboring Quezon City. David Camru, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.